They slid the letter across the mahogany table like it was a napkin. Effective immediately. My stepbrother said, voice even and thin as glass. Clear your office by Friday. For a beat, the room was nothing but the hum of the air conditioner and the soft rustle of paper. My name hung on the desk in a brass plate I'd had engraved when I turned 40. I had built that desk, that floor plan, and most of the clients who paid the bills. I'd been the person who knew the routes, the schedules, the vendors who never missed a truck. And now a sheet of paper told me I was surplus to requirements in a company my father had spent his life building. My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 42, and until 15 minutes ago, I was Chief Operating Officer of Donovan and Reed Logistics, a regional freight and warehousing firm that traced its roots to my grandfather's single truck. I walked out of that boardroom with a cardboard box and the kind of tight, curious calm that comes when a person's worst private fear finally gets named in public. My stepbrother, Miles Hart, decades younger and a graduate of the kind of business school my father admired at cocktail parties, had been appointed interim CEO by a majority of the board. Dad, Thomas Donovan, had sat there with a blank look that could have been regret or exhaustion. He and I had not been on the same page for some time. The notice on the table cited strategic reorganization and leadership realignment. The board's lip service version of history always sounds like strategy. The simpler story is that the succession plan my father had been drafting for years had collided with pride, and someone had flipped the page on me. People who haven't lived inside family business turf tend to think it's clean, polite lunches, suits, and civic awards. They don't see the tiny, persistent forces that erode trust, the favors that look like charity, the compliments that are currency, the casual sidelining disguised as counsel. The truth is messier. It smells of coffee and old paper, and the faint tang of diesel that the warehouse never quite loses. It smells like the particulars of the job. The drivers who call at 2 in the morning, the vendor who takes a week to answer, the client who wants 3 changes before breakfast. I loved that world because it had rules and consequences. You learn to measure your life in schedules rather than in applause. I should have expected the maneuver. Maybe that's arrogance. Maybe it's a woman's intuition honed by years of risk matrices and route optimizations. Miles had always been handsome to the kind of people who prefer ambition on a resume to knowledge in the field. He was poised at networking events and charming with recruiters. He'd never been on a loading dock past noon, but he had a board-friendly smile, a glossy LinkedIn, and a way of saying things that made donors feel seen. That image had a cost. People are bad at mistaking volume for depth. The opening salvo had been surgical. A succession memo, a quiet reshuffling of a couple of committee chairs, the removal of a few mid-level executives who had been my allies. Then the board convened and announced the change. I left the room with a certain lightness despite the humiliation. There are times when being pushed matters less than moving toward something. Back home, I unpacked my thoughts into a leather portfolio I had kept for precisely this kind of contingency, the one that sits in a drawer labeled, "In case of emergency," because we all, in our little quiet ways, prepare for the day when the plan meets resistance. It was not a legal trap or a knife. It was paperwork I'd assembled over 10 years, the sort of careful structuring that pragmatic people build as insurance. I'd created an independent consulting firm, Donovan Strategy Group, and over 5 years I'd encouraged, with candor and paperwork, a set of major clients to contract with that entity rather than with Donovan and Reed directly. On paper, it looked like a tax efficiency move, a flexibility strategy that allowed us to negotiate quickly with clients who needed bespoke logistics solutions. In practice, it had been my slow insurance policy. When I'd proposed the arrangement years earlier, Dad had shrugged. "If it helps you manage accounts, do it," he'd said, more interested in operations being smoother than in accounting technicalities. He'd never read the fine print. He trusted me to build systems, not to build leverage. Yet the leverage was there, quiet and patient, like a piece of machinery that hums until someone touches the wrong button. I called Beth Carmichael, the head of procurement at one of our largest clients, mid-afternoon. We'd worked together for 8 years, and Beth was one of those people who treat business like a careful craft. "Val?" she said when she answered. She didn't yet know it was a pivot, but you can hear the short intake when people sense a shift. "Val, congratulations," she said. We saw the announcement about the leadership change. Are you all right? I'm fine, I said. But listen, check the contract header for the True North Freight account. There was a brief silence, the kind that happens when someone goes to consult a file they can't see in their head. Donovan Strategy Group? She read slowly. This is weird. Is this new? No, I said, relief folding through me like a tide. It's been like that for 5 years. By sunset calls had come in from 3 other major clients, manufacturing firms, a regional grocery chain, an e-commerce player whose fulfillment network Donovan and Reed had been integrating regionally. The words were variations on the same theme. We want continuity. Our agreement is with Donovan Strategy Group. We have a relationship with Claire. Please clarify. Miles' plan had been to make a clean narrative, bring in fresh leadership, reduce overhead, cut an old guard. But he hadn't counted on a simple fact. Clients are people with memory and loyalty. They know the person who solved their holiday bottleneck at 2 a.m. They remember the driver who refused to leave a load at a closed dock. They remember the person who picks up the phone. I was the person who had become the face of the company's results. I could have gone back inside. I could have begged for clarity, for meetings, for a role that wasn't a polishing job. But I had already chosen otherwise. I had an LLC, a roster of clients, and a gritty little crew who trusted competence over titles. On impulse that felt far more honest than a seat at a table that had decided to table me. By midnight, my living room had become a command center. Legal pads, vendor contacts, selective emails. By morning, I had an inbox of commitments. 5 clients with firm timelines willing to move their procurement and operations work to Donovan Strategy Group for the next quarter on the condition the transition was seamless. That total represented more than 60% of Donovan and Reed's top-line revenue. It was not a total knockout, but it was leverage of the highest order. The next morning, Miles sent a terse message asking me to attend an urgent operational meeting. He wanted to know why panicked clients had been calling and to present a unified face to the board. I called my lawyer, Theo Martinez, and asked him to come to the meeting. I also sent a one-line response to Miles. I will attend with counsel. He stalled when he saw me enter the boardroom with Theo at my elbow and an extra folder of documents stacked like an affront. The board was composed of people who loved process. They also loved the illusion of being the first to know. When I laid out the contracts, clear, signed, stamped with their purchase order numbers, corporate seals, and 15 lines of service level specifics, the room felt oddly small. It is a particular kind of power to know what the other side has not read. The Donovan Strategy Group has been our preferred vendor for True North and 3 other accounts on a retainer basis for 5 years, I said. Your restructuring doesn't change the contracts the clients hold. They have every right to maintain the relationship they believe secures their service. Miles' face flashed something that looked like panic, an unfamiliar tremor in the curated cadence he always used. He had been counting on the rhetoric of stewardship, new vision, new cost controls. He didn't expect a quiet legal structure he hadn't examined. He hadn't read the contracts because he had never needed to understand the knitting that made our operation run. He was used to believing in the story men like him tell themselves at board lunches, that charisma trumps craft. The board counseled and debated. Some members murmured about fiduciary duty and corporate formality. My father looked between us with a fog of regret and the throttle of an old man thinking maybe he'd chosen the easier path in selecting a successor. After a long, bruising session, several things happened quickly. A handful of board members who had been on record as Miles' allies read the contracts aloud in the room. They were not pleased to learn what had been signed under their noses. It's a small thing, the slam of a folder or the clearing of a throat, but it rearranges power in the room. Miles called me dangerous in the corridor when no one else could hear. You set this up to be untouchable, he hissed. You waited and then you leapt. I set this up to protect what we built, I replied. You set up a press release. He spat a brief pronouncement. You'll regret this. He made it sound like a threat to a person, not to a business. Regret is a strange currency. People spend it later when choices reveal their consequences. My choices had been planned, methodical, and patient. Regret would be his. In the days that followed, the company's PR team published a statement about a leadership transition and a mutually agreed upon consulting arrangement to retain certain accounts with Donovan Strategy Group as a subcontractor. It was a face-saving compromise meant to settle the immediate panic among investors and clients. But the truth was more complicated. The clients wanted continuity and contractual certainty. Donovan Strategy Group would serve as their ongoing partner while Donovan and Reed fulfilled logistical operations. The company had to reconcile internal brand pride with the more pressing reality of operational continuity. Miles fought for control everywhere he could. He wanted to reassign account managers, demand rate concessions, and push for immediate cost cuts that would have been visible to Wall Street but disastrous to service continuity. I gently refused each overreach, citing clause after clause from our signed service agreements that preserved the client's autonomies. By week 2, half the operations staff had been quietly reached by former colleagues and asked whether they might consider an alternate offer. There is a particular thing that happens when your job is about loyalty to schedule rather than oath of office. People listen when their livelihoods are threatened. Jordan, our operations manager, texted, "We're ready to walk. How quickly do you need us? You learn who will stand in the rain for you in slow economies." Jordan had been my second in command for 7 years. He had worn his loyalty like a badge, but he had also been the man I trusted to show up at 2 a.m. on a snowy Tuesday to reroute trucks. He and half the crew were ready to move if it meant preserving a livelihood with dignity. We arranged a meeting in a rented workspace that smelled like drywall and new paint, the temporary headquarters of what would become something more. Over the next week, we put together a skeleton crew of core operations staff. Jordan, 2 veteran dispatchers, a finance analyst who knew the quirks of our invoicing software, and Natalie, my assistant who had been at Donovan and Reed for 10 years. They each signed on not because of a promise of riches, but because of trust. That is a different contract than the one you sign on paper. We had the clients, the expertise, and the mechanism to run freight. What we did not have was infrastructure at scale. Donovan and Reed had warehouses under contract in 3 states. We needed temporary fulfillment partners. I called regional contacts I'd maintained through the years, a third-party warehouse in Chattanooga, a fulfillment hub in Louisville, and a boutique courier service that specialized in rushed lane deliveries. Each was willing to work with us on temporary terms in exchange for guaranteed volume and prompt payment. I negotiated deliverables on napkins and emails and built the skeleton of a network that could carry weight. The media smelled of drama. Local business reporters called, sour with the scent of a family scandal that had corporate legs. Miles did everything a public face should. Interviews layered with rhetoric about modernization and efficiency. He was polished on camera. His sentences were crisp, rehearsed. I did none of that. I was busy building the plane in the air. One morning, as phones rang and servers hummed, our first large transition shipment left the dock, a load of medical supplies for a healthcare client who could not tolerate delay. I watched the tracking feed on my laptop and felt something like elation and terror braided together. It arrived on time. The client called praise and a short thank you note. Seamless transition. Thank you. That small, precise success became the seed that wound through the rest of our week. Weeks turned into months of gritty motion. We tracked every pallet by serial number. We followed contracts like cartographers. We invested profits into small redundancies so drivers wouldn't be stranded if a weather front slammed one route. When the board of Donovan and Reed tried to muscle clients back via formal letters appealing to brand loyalty, the clients pointed at service history and said in essence, "This is about results, not logos." At the first quarterly meeting after the split, we had signed 2 new regional accounts and retained 7 of the largest contracts that once formed Donovan and Reed's backbone. Our team had grown to 25 employees, architects of a system that could flex while staying reliable. We had not just survived. We had poked a hole in the assumption that large brands automatically dominate. The market began to murmur. The new company with the old team was earning praise for responsiveness. Miles' anger hardened into strategy. He sued in small, bureaucratic ways. Breach of fiduciary duty, the board announced. Improper solicitation. The legal volley was messy and expensive, and it required focus. I had Theo and a slim counsel team working the edges. His case was less about facts The documents were clear, and more about machinations. He tried to argue that our client pitches had been improper, that we had coerced staff to resign. The courts are slow and, ultimately, interested in the law, not rhetoric. We had the contracts. We had the invoices. We had the proofs. In the public hearing, Miles paced and presented flourishes. He had charisma, but not the quiet, dull evidence that tends to win in courtrooms. At home, the cost was quiet and steady. My father stopped answering my calls for weeks. He sent a letter, terse, full of the old paternal admonitions, that felt like a remnant of a life where men expected subservience and rewarded spectacle. I missed our exchanges. I missed the salty, plain way he used to speak about work. He had been a man of action who'd preferred the idea of family cohesion to the mess of corporate truth. I never needed his blessing to keep working, but I had needed the small human recognition that a child's best work was seen. Months later, at a dinner in a small restaurant near the docks, my father asked to meet. He looked smaller than the office photos had made him. The weight of a company nearly collapsing has a way of aging a person quickly. "You built something," he said, not as a question, but an admission. "You made it without us." "I didn't set out to hurt you," I replied. "You didn't," he said. "You protected what you could." His voice cracked in a way that made us both quiet. It was not the emotional absolution of a movie. It was an ordinary, late apology from a man who had learned a lesson at a cost. We had successes and also losses. We had investors who wanted to buy our growing platform and then change it into a different animal. We had staff who left because the stress was too large. But the team we had was ours. We built a culture that valued practical candor, not optics. We installed rotational schedules that respected drivers' family lives and argued for fairer margins for warehouse staff. It was a different kind of empire. 6 months in, Miles sat across a table from me in a mediation room, a scene that felt like a kind of closure. He had been through bruises, the PR missteps, the failed attempts to buy back goodwill with public letters, the board's slow cooling to his rhetoric. He had the look of someone who had discovered the difference between being liked and being relied upon. "You underestimated us," he said, eyes narrowed. "You underestimated continuity," I returned. "You thought people belonged to a brand before they belonged to a relationship." His face went slack. That was the line my father had once used at family dinners, the one that had always felt like a parental aphorism. To Miles, it was a hard truth. At the mediation's end, he had no snappy rejoinder. The settlement was practical. Donovan and Reed would retain minority shareholder status in certain contracts. Donovan's strategy group would continue as the primary operations partner on the major accounts for the next 2 years at negotiated rates. The board publicly framed it as cooperation. Privately, it read as surrender tempered with preservation. Miles kept his title for a while, but with limited authority over the accounts that mattered most. What tasted most like victory, and what left him speechless, was not the legal language. It was the sight of our first fully independent logistics center humming under our label 6 months after we left the old campus. It sat in a renovated warehouse with exposed beams and crates labeled in a tidy font. The first time Miles visited, escorted by 2 board members, he walked the floor in silence. The men he had once thought he could boss were now the same ones giving directions. Jordan gave him a nod that was neither warm nor cold. It was the nod of someone who had weathered night storms with the group he'd chosen. Miles stood among the pallets like a guest in someone else's market and looked, for the first time, small. Weeks later, at a local industry event the press had called a reconciliation lecture, my father introduced me on stage in front of clients, partners, and the board. He did not apologize in public the way tabloids expect. He thanked me for stewarding a system he had failed to guard. His words were short and true. There was something stoic in his tone, a kind of private respect given in a public place, which to me had more grit than a long, dramatic apology. Victory in business is a strange thing. It tastes like coffee and paperwork and the soft relief that comes when a route you planned finally runs on time. But the day it became truly quiet, when the warehouse lights dimmed after a long day and I walked the aisles and felt the hum of engines and the gentle clink of chains in the evening, I realized the cost. Successful survival sometimes leaves scars where relationships once were. The company I had once led from within was now an important client and a partner at the table. My younger stepbrother, who had once held a letter like a napkin and thought he'd pushed me into the wind, had learned, as many do, the difference between looking powerful and actually being indispensable. We closed that year with numbers that would make any bank nod and a culture that began to pride itself on quiet competence. Our team had given up weekends and comfort to build what we had. The success tasted like the clean edge of victory and the warm, quieter aftertaste of belonging, the kind that comes when your coworkers become your coalition. A part of the journey felt almost biblical. I had been cast out, tested, and then returned, not to the same chair at the same table, but to a place where my work stood on its own. I had reclaimed dignity, not by burning the house down, but by building a new one with the people who'd chosen to stand with me. When people asked me later if I'd take the old job back if given the chance, I would smile. No, I told them. I'd rather run a company where people know where the bolts are and how they hold. If you're listening to this as a story, as a parable of persistence, remember a few practical truths. First, build layers of protection in your work, contracts, relationships, redundancies. Don't be romantic about loyalty. It should be tested by practice. Second, when power shifts, keep your calm and your records. The quiet evidence usually outlives the loud argument. Third, people matter more than titles. You'll build something from relationships, not press releases. And for Miles, who one day asked me with an honesty that surprised me, "What did you want out of all this?" I replied, "I wanted not to be erased by a press release. I wanted my work to be seen for itself." He considered this, and for the first time since he held that dismissal note like a weapon, he was speechless.